The Arizona sun was a merciless god, and Josephine Bellwether had long since stopped praying to it for salvation. Her prayers had turned to pleas whispered into the cracked earth, with a tongue swollen from thirst. Her family's ranch was a smear of ash on the horizon, her father's dream devoured by the greed of a man named Sean Kane. Now she was the last remnant of the Bellwether name, hunted and dying in the vast, indifferent wilderness. When the shadows of the riders fell over her, she didn't see salvation. She saw an end. But as the Apache warrior stared down at her, his face a mask of stone, a different prayer formed a desperate, shameful bargain for one more sunrise. The heat was a physical weight. It pressed down on Josephine's shoulders, shimmered in waves off the ochre-colored dirt, and baked the very moisture from her thoughts, leaving behind only the grit of despair. 3 days. It had been 3 days since she'd fled the smoking ruins of the Broken Spur Ranch. 3 days since the smell of burning pine and something sickeningly sweet had chased her into the unforgiving embrace of the Sonoran Desert. Her father, a man whose hands were as tough and calloused as old leather, but whose eyes held the gentle optimism of a prairie dawn, was gone. Her younger brother Thomas, whose laughter used to echo off the canyon walls as he practiced with his slingshot, was silenced. They were victims not of drought or disease, but of a cancer in a black hat named Sean Kane. Kane had wanted their water. The small, steadfast creek that trickled through Bellwether land was a thread of life in a dying tapestry, and he was a man who collected such threads, twisting them into a noose for his competitors. He'd made offers, then threats. When Pa, a man of stubborn integrity, refused to sell the legacy he'd built with his own 2 hands, Kane's threats had turned to fire in the night. Josephine had escaped only because she'd been in the spring house, the stone walls muffling the initial chaos. She emerged to a vision of hell, the main house engulfed in flame. The silhouettes of Kane's men stark against the inferno. She ran. She ran without thought, without direction, propelled only by the primal instinct to live. Now that instinct was flickering like a dying candle. Her calico dress was torn and stained, her boots shredded by sharp rock and thorny scrub. Her lips were split and bleeding, and a relentless sun hammered at her skull. She stumbled over a rock, her ankle twisting with a sickening pop. A cry of pain, dry and rasping, was stolen by the wind. She collapsed in the meager shade of a skeletal mesquite tree, the fight finally draining out of her. This was it. The end of the Bellwether line, a forgotten footnote in a land that swallowed up stories and bones with equal indifference. She closed her eyes, the image of her mother's locket lost in the fire, flashing in her mind. She thought she was hallucinating when she first heard it, the soft, rhythmic thud of unshod hooves on packed earth. Her eyes snapped open. They weren't cavalry. They weren't Kane's men. They were 5 riders, their skin the color of burnished copper, their black hair long and unbound, save for simple headbands. They moved with the silent, fluid grace of predators, their wiry ponies, as tough and enduring as the land itself. Apache. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through the haze of her delirium. Every horror story she'd ever heard, whispered in the town of Tombstone, coalesced into a single paralyzing certainty. A death by the sun would have been a mercy. The riders formed a silent circle around her. They didn't speak, simply observed her with dark, impenetrable eyes. They saw the tattered dress, the pale skin blistering in the sun, the wild, terrified look of a cornered animal. One of them, clearly the leader, dismounted. He was taller than the others, with a hard, lean build. His face was all sharp angles, and planes a hawk-like nose, and a jaw that looked as if it had been carved from granite. There were no beads, no bright feathers, just the stark functionality of a man at war with the world. His eyes, black and piercing, held no pity. He approached her, his moccasins making no sound. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing her worth. Her threat level, her remaining vitality. She was nothing. A piece of human debris. Josephine pushed herself up on her elbows, the pain in her ankle, a distant, unimportant signal. All her terror, all her grief, all her rage at Sean Kane funneled into a single desperate desire to not die here like this, not to be left for the buzzards as another casualty of this brutal land. Words tumbled from her broken lips, a raw, croaking sound. Please. The warrior's expression didn't change. He understood the word, if not the sentiment. She dragged herself forward, clawing at the dirt, the shame of her own pleading, burning hotter than the sun. She had no pride, left only the raw animal need to breathe, for one more minute, one more hour. She looked up at his impassive face, into those unreadable eyes. She knew what they would likely do to a white woman captured alone. She knew the stories. But death was certain here in the dust. With them there was a flicker of a chance, no matter how grim. "Don't kill me," she begged, the words tearing at her raw throat. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not compassion, but perhaps curiosity at her audacity. She pushed on, offering the only thing she had left. Her body, her utility, her submission. "Use me." She whispered the words, tasting like ash and humiliation. "Do what you want. Make me a slave, a whore, anything. Use me, just don't let me die." The warrior stared down at her for a long moment. The other riders murmured behind him in their guttural tongue. He tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. He had seen women beg before. He had seen them cry and scream. He had never seen one offer herself up with the cold, clear-eyed desperation of a trader making a final ruinous bargain. He saw not a weak woman, but a creature with a will to survive so fierce it was willing to burn its own soul for fuel. He gave a short, sharp command in his own language. One of the other men dismounted, pulling a water skin from his pony. The leader took it, knelt, and held it out to her. It was not an act of kindness. It was an act of acceptance. The bargain had been struck. As Josephine greedily drank the lukewarm water, letting it spill down her chin and onto her chest, she didn't feel relief. She felt the chilling finality of her choice. She had traded her life for her freedom, her past for a terrifyingly uncertain future. The warrior whose name she did not know had just become her owner. The journey to the Apache rancheria was a blur of pain and jarring motion. The warrior whose name she learned was Tuklo, after hearing the others say it had bound her ankle with surprising skill, using strips of cloth from her own petticoat and a poultice of crushed leaves that numbed the worst of the ache. He had lifted her onto the back of his pony, seating her in front of him, with an impersonal efficiency that was more chilling than outright brutality. His body was a wall of heat and hard muscle at her back, yet there was no touch that wasn't strictly necessary to keep her from falling. She was a piece of property, a tool, a spoil of the raid that never was. The camp was hidden deep within the Dragoon Mountains, a place of stark vertical beauty and lethal shadows. It was not a collection of tippies, as she'd foolishly imagined from penny dreadfuls, but a scattered settlement of domed wickiup structures of bent branches covered in brush and hides that blended almost perfectly into the landscape. Her arrival caused an immediate stir. Women stopped their work of grinding mesquite beans or scraping hides, their faces hardening as they saw her. Children who had been laughing and playing fell silent and stared with wide, curious eyes. Dogs, lean and wolf-like, snarled at the edges of the commotion until a sharp word from one of the warriors sent them slinking away. Josephine was an intrusion, a ghost from a world that had brought them nothing but misery and war. The hatred in their gazes was a palpable thing, a cloak of thorns that settled over her. She was the color of the cavalry that hunted them, of the miners who stole their land, of the sickness that ravaged their children. Tuklo slid off the pony and pulled her down, his grip firm on her arm. He spoke to an older woman who emerged from a larger wickiup. Her face was a road map of wrinkles, her eyes like chips of obsidian. She spat on the ground near Josephine's feet, her meaning clear in any language. Tuklo spoke again, his tone low but unyielding. There was a terse exchange. The old woman Izeba shot Josephine another look of pure venom before turning and disappearing back into her dwelling. Josephine's life in the camp began. The bargain she had made in her delirium was now her waking reality. "Use me," she had said, and they did. She was given the tasks no one else wanted. She hauled water from the spring, a grueling, repetitive journey that made her arms and back ache with a fire that never quit. She gathered firewood, her hands, once accustomed to needlepoint, and the cool ivory of piano keys becoming cracked and filled with splinters. She was tasked with scraping the last bits of flesh and gristle from animal hides, a nauseating job that left her smelling of blood and decay. She was given scraps of food, barely enough to sustain her, and at night she slept on a worn hide in a small isolated wickiup, shivering more from loneliness than the cold desert air. No one spoke to her, except to bark an order. If she was too slow, a sharp word or a shove would hurry her along. Izeba, in particular, seemed to find a grim satisfaction in her suffering, often adding to her workload or, accidentally, kicking over her water bucket, forcing her to make the long trek again. Through it all, Tuklo remained a distant, watchful presence. He was not her tormentor. He did not beat her or subject her to the violation she had dreaded. His cruelty was one of apathy. He had accepted her bargain, and as long as she was useful, he would not let her die. That was the extent of their contract. He would watch her sometimes as she worked, his expression unreadable. Was he assessing her worth? Waiting for her to break, she couldn't tell. He was a stone wall, and she was just a weed growing at its base. One evening, as she was scrubbing a pot with sand by the communal fire, a small boy no older than 5 tripped and fell near her, cutting his knee on a sharp rock. He began to cry, a universal sound of childhood pain. Before she could think, Josephine reached out her hands, moving with an instinct she'd learned from tending to Thomas. She murmured soft, soothing words, the English syllables meaningless to him, but the tone unmistakable. Suddenly the boy's mother was there. She snatched the child away, as if Josephine were poison, shrieking at her in the Apache tongue. She held her son close, inspecting his knee as if Josephine had been the one to inflict the wound. The woman's fear and hatred were so intense, so absolute, that Josephine recoiled as if struck. She was not just an enemy. She was a contamination. A sickness. Later that night, curled in her cold wickiup, Josephine wept silent tears. They weren't tears of self-pity, but of profound, aching loneliness. She had begged to live, but this existence felt like a hollow echo of life. She was a ghost among these people, a constant, unwelcome reminder of the world outside their mountain fortress. Her plea had saved her from the sun and the buzzards, but it had imprisoned her in a cage of isolation, where the bars were made of the unbridgeable canyon between their two peoples. She looked at her hands in the faint moonlight filtering through the brush walls. They were raw, calloused, and stained with the grime of hard labor. They were no longer the hands of Josephine Bellwether, the rancher's daughter. They were the hands of a survivor, ugly and strong, and as she stared at them, a flicker of the old Bellwether stubbornness ignited in the pit of her stomach. They could use her. They could hate her. But she had made a bargain, not just to live, but to survive. And survival meant more than just breathing. It meant enduring. It meant watching, learning, and finding a way to be more than just the white woman who begged for her life. Months bled into one another, seasons turning with the subtle shifts of the desert's palette. The blistering heat of summer gave way to the crisp, cool nights of autumn. Josephine's body hardened. The constant ache in her muscles became a familiar hum of strength. Her skin, despite her efforts to shield it, darkened to a brownish hue, and her hair, once carefully pinned, grew long and wild, bleached by the sun. More importantly, her mind sharpened. She stopped being a passive victim and became an active observer. Her survival depended on it. She began to understand the rhythms of the rancheria. She learned which women were quicker to anger and which might turn a blind eye if she rested for a moment too long. She learned the meanings of gestures, the intonations that signaled approval or danger. And she learned their language, not by being taught, but by listening. Words and phrases repeated daily began to stick. Onde for the people, tu for water, glesh for dog. She hoarded these words like precious gems, turning them over in her mind, fitting them into the patterns of the life around her. She never spoke them aloud, fearing the ridicule or wrath it might provoke. They were her secret, a small measure of control in a life where she had none. Tuklo remained an enigma. He provided her with a new pair of moccasins when her old boots finally disintegrated, leaving them outside her wickiup without a word. He would occasionally leave a larger portion of meat for her after a successful hunt. These were not gestures of kindness, she told herself, but of maintenance. A master does not let his tools fall into disrepair, yet she sometimes caught his eyes on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The cold indifference was still there, but it was now mingled with something else. A flicker of calculation, perhaps, or a sliver of curiosity. The turning point came during a season of sickness. A coughing illness swept through the camp, hitting the very young and the very old the hardest. The tribe's medicine woman, a wise elder named Tsoai, worked tirelessly, using her vast knowledge of desert plants. But the sickness was persistent. Izeba's small granddaughter, a bright-eyed girl named Chide, was among the worst afflicted. Her small body was racked with fever, and a deep, rattling cough that stole her breath. Josephine watched from a distance as Izeba, her usual harshness, replaced by a mask of raw fear, refused to leave the girl's side. Josephine's mind flew back to her own childhood. Her mother, a practical woman from Pennsylvania, had her own set of remedies passed down through generations. She remembered her mother brewing a strong, pungent tea from mullein leaves for Thomas's chest colds, and forcing them to breathe in the steam from a pot of boiled thyme to clear their lungs. Mullein and wild thyme. She had seen both plants growing in the higher elevations where she gathered firewood. It was a terrifying risk. To interfere could be seen as an attempt to poison the child, a crime for which she would surely be killed. But to do nothing to watch the little girl waste away while she held a potential remedy felt like a betrayal of her own humanity. That night, under the cover of darkness, she slipped out of the camp. Her ankle, long since healed, was strong and sure on the rocky path. She found the familiar velvety leaves of the mullein plant and the fragrant sprigs of thyme. She returned to the camp like a ghost, her heart pounding against her ribs. She built up the fire outside her wickiup and boiled the herbs in a small, cracked pot. The aromatic steam rose into the cold night air. She waited, her entire being coiled in a knot of anxiety. As she had hoped and feared, a shadow fell over her. It was Tuklo. He had approached without a sound. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. He spoke in Apache, but his meaning was clear from his suspicious glare at the steaming pot. This was the moment. For the first time, Josephine spoke his language. Her voice was hesitant, the accent thick and clumsy, but the words were there. "Medicine," she said, looking up at him, her eyes pleading for understanding, for the cough, for chide. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, though she saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes that she could speak at all. He looked from her to the pot, then in the direction of Iseba's wickiup, where the sound of the child's labored breathing was a faint, tragic rhythm in the night. He knew Tsoai's remedies were not working. He had seen the despair in his people's faces. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a silent judge weighing her life in his hands. Then, without a word, he turned and walked to Iseba's dwelling. He spoke to the old woman. Josephine couldn't hear the words, only the sharp, protesting tones of Iseba's voice, followed by Tuklo's firm, unyielding response. A moment later, he returned. "Bring it," he commanded. Her hands trembling, Josephine carried the pot to Iseba's wickiup. The old woman glared at her with pure hatred, but she stood aside, forced to obey Tuklo's command. Inside the little girl was a pitiful sight, her face flushed with fever. Josephine dipped a piece of cloth into the tea, cooled it, and gently moistened the child's lips. Then she held the pot so the warm herbal steam could rise around her face. She stayed there all night, repeatedly applying the tea and ensuring the steam tented around the child. Iseba watched her every move, her suspicion a palpable force. Tuklo stood guard at the entrance, a silent, imposing sentinel. By dawn, a small miracle had occurred. Chide's fever had lessened, and her breathing was less ragged. She was still weak, but the desperate, clawing edge of the sickness had retreated. When Josephine finally emerged from the wickiup, blinking in the morning light, exhausted but alive, she saw Iseba holding her sleeping granddaughter. The old woman looked at Josephine, and for the first time, the venom in her eyes was gone. It was replaced by a grudging, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Tuklo was still there, leaning against a rock. He watched her approach, his gaze intense. He didn't thank her. He didn't praise her. He simply said in his own tongue, "You have a strong spirit, Ina woman. Iyana. Life." It wasn't her name, but it was the first thing he had called her besides an order. It was more than a word. It was a seed of acknowledgement planted in the stone of his indifference, or, for the first time since she'd been dragged into this camp, Josephine felt a sliver of hope that she could be something more than a captive, something more than a tool. She might one day become a person again. The change in the camp was not sudden, but it was undeniable. The name Tuklo had given her, Ina, began to stick. At first it was used with a hint of irony, but as the story of Chide's recovery spread, the irony faded. Josephine was no longer just the nameless white woman. She was Ina, the one who had brought her life back from the brink. Iseba's hostility softened into a guarded neutrality. She began leaving a piece of jerky or a handful of roasted pignon nuts for Josephine. Small gestures that spoke volumes. The other women still kept their distance, but the glares of pure hatred were replaced with looks of wary curiosity. She was still an outsider, but she was no longer a pariah. Her relationship with Tuklo also shifted, settling into a new, unspoken rhythm. He began to teach her things not as a master to a slave, but as a warrior training a recruit. He showed her how to read the tracks of deer and coyote in the dust, how to find water by watching the flight of birds, how to distinguish the sound of a threat from the ordinary whispers of the wind. He taught her to use a knife not just for skinning hides, but for defense, his hands guiding hers with a firm, impersonal touch that still sent a jolt through her. Josephine, in turn, found herself opening up in small ways. She told him about her father's ranch, about the mechanics of a water pump, about the way her brother could hit a tin can from 50 paces with his slingshot. She spoke of her world not with longing, but as one might describe a distant country they had once visited. During one of these lessons, as he was showing her how to fletch an arrow, he asked the question that had hung between them for months. "This man who burned your home," he said, not looking at her, his focus on trimming the feather with a shard of obsidian. "What is his name?" "Sean Kane." She answered the name, tasting like poison on her tongue. "He owns the Double K Ranch, now north of Tombstone. He wanted our water. He wants all the water." Tuclo's hands stilled. "Kane," he repeated the name, a low growl. "We know this man. He pushes his cattle onto our hunting grounds. His men shoot at our scouts. He is a man with a sickness for land." A cold dread washed over Josephine. The world she had escaped and the world that had captured her were on a collision course, and she was standing at the point of impact. The collision came sooner than she expected. A few weeks later, 2 Apache scouts returned to the camp, one of them with a bloody gash on his arm. They brought news a group of white men, well armed, and led by a big man in a black hat, were camped near a place the Apache called the Weeping Springs, a sacred place deep within their territory. They were panning for gold, fouling the water, and shooting at anything that moved. Tuclo's face became a mask of cold fury. This was a desecration that could not be ignored. He gathered a war party of 20 men. As they prepared their ponies and weapons, a knot of fear tightened in Josephine's stomach. She knew with a bone-deep certainty that it was Sean Kane. As Tuclo mounted his pony, she approached him. "Let me come," she said, the word surprising even herself. He looked down at her, his eyes questioning. "This is not a woman's work. I know his men," she insisted, her voice urgent. "I know how they think. They are arrogant. They will be careless. I can watch. I can listen. They won't expect me." He considered her words. He saw the fire in her eyes, the set of her jaw. She was not the same woman he had found dying in the desert. She was harder, sharper. And she had a reason to hate Sean Kane that was as deep and personal as his own. To bring a white woman a captive on a raid was unheard of. But her logic was sound. She was an unexpected weapon. "You will do exactly as I say," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You will make no sound. You will stay hidden. If you are a danger to my men, I will leave you where you stand." "I understand," she said. He pulled her up onto the pony behind him, and they rode out with the war party melting into the rocky landscape. They found Kane's camp 2 days later. From a high ridge they looked down on the dozen men who lounged around a fire, their rifles leaning carelessly against rocks, a string of pack mules grazing nearby. And there, larger than life, was Sean Kane. He stood over the spring, a gold pan in his hands, his face contorted with greed. Seeing him again sent a wave of nausea and pure, unadulterated hatred through Josephine. Tuclo planned a silent attack at dawn, but as they watched, Josephine noticed something. 2 of Kane's men were taking the mules and heading up a narrow, winding trail away from the main camp, likely to a higher pasture. She crept to Tuclo's side. 2 men, she whispered in Apache, pointing. "They are leaving. Kane will not expect an attack to come from behind him up that trail." Tuclo followed her gaze. It was a clever observation. An attack from 2 directions would sow maximum confusion. He gave her a sharp, appraising look and then issued a series of quiet commands. He split his force, sending a small group to silently dispatch the 2 men with the mules and take their position. The attack was swift and brutal. The Apache warriors descended on the camp like vengeful spirits at the first light of dawn. But Cain was a viper. In the chaos, as his men were cut down, he managed to grab a rifle and take cover behind a boulder. From his hiding place with Josephine, Tuklo drew his bow, seeking a clear shot. At that moment, Cain, trying to get a better vantage point, moved. His eyes, sweeping the ridge for attackers, suddenly widened. He froze his rifle half-raised. He wasn't looking at Tuklo or the other warriors. He was staring directly at Josephine. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He mouthed her name. Josephine. The vulture had found his lost prize. And in his eyes, she could see a new, terrifying objective taking shape. It wasn't about gold anymore. It was about reclaiming what he believed was his property. The fight had just become deeply, horrifyingly personal. The raid was a success for the Apache, but a chilling failure for Josephine. Cain, using the shock of seeing her as a diversion, had managed to escape, in the chaos, disappearing into the labyrinthine canyons. They had driven him from their sacred springs. But now he knew she was alive. And he knew who she was with. The journey back to the rancheria was tense. Tuklo was silent, his brow furrowed in thought. He knew, as Josephine did, that Cain was not a man to let things go. He was a cancer that, once discovered, would only grow more aggressive. She was no longer just a captive. She was a liability, a beacon that could draw Cain's fire directly to their hidden home. The fear of this new reality settled on Josephine like a shroud. She had watched Tuklo and his men fight. They were fierce, brilliant warriors, but they were few. Cain had money and influence. He could bring back a private army or worse, lead the cavalry to their doorstep with tales of a white woman held against her will. She expected Tuklo to cast her out, to leave her in the desert again, to remove the target from his people. It would have been the logical, strategic thing to do. Instead, he did something that shattered all her expectations. A few nights after their return, he came to her wickiup. He didn't enter, but stood outside, a tall silhouette, against the star-dusted sky. "Cain will come back," he stated. It was not a question. "I know," Josephine whispered, her heart sinking. "I will leave. I can draw him away." "And die," Tuklo's voice was flat. "You would run to your death. It would protect your people. It's my fault, he knows." "You are not at fault for the greed of a white man," he cut her off. "His war with us began long before he saw you. But now you are the reason he will make it a personal hunt. He thinks you belong to him. He will come to claim his property." Josephine flinched at the word. "I am not his property." "No," Tuklo said, and his voice softened almost imperceptibly. "You are not." He was silent for a long moment, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. "In our way," he began slowly, "when a woman is without a protector, no father, no brother, no husband, she is vulnerable. Others can claim her or harm her, and she has no one to demand justice for her. You are such a woman." She understood his meaning. In this tribe, she was utterly alone, her status tenuous, based only on his protection. "Cain believes you are his to take." Tuklo continued, his gaze intense. "The other men in this camp, they see you as a white woman, a stranger. They would not risk their lives for you, but for the wife of a warrior, for one of the people, they would fight to the death." The air grew thick with the weight of his unspoken words. Josephine's breath hitched in her chest. This wasn't a proposal born of love or affection, not in the way her world understood it. It was a strategic alliance, a political move. It was a vow of protection offered in the only way his culture could make it binding and absolute. To make her his wife was to make her Apache. It was to draw a line in the sand and declare to Sean Kane and the entire world that she was under his, and by extension, the tribe's protection. "If you are my wife," he said, his voice a low, serious rumble, "no man will touch you without answering to me. Your safety becomes my honor. Your life becomes the life of my family. Cain will not be coming for a lost white woman. He will be coming for the wife of Tuklo. It is a different war." She looked at him, at his hard, unsmiling face, illuminated by the moon. He was offering her a shield, a name, a place within the circle of the Ande. He was offering her a home, forged not of love, but of mutual respect and shared danger. It was a far cry from the girlish dreams she once had of a church wedding and a white picket fence, but those dreams had burned to ash with her family's ranch. This was reality, this was survival, and somewhere deep inside her, she recognized it as something more. It was a testament to the journey she had made. He no longer saw her as the pathetic creature who begged for her life in the dust. He saw a survivor, a woman with a strong spirit, a woman he was willing to bind his honor to. She thought of the alternative, being cast out, hunted by Cain, or remaining in the camp as a perpetual outsider, a ghost with no name. She looked at Tuklo, at the quiet strength in his eyes, and saw not a captor, but a protector. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The ceremony, if it could be called that, was starkly simple. The next day, Tuklo brought a fine deer he had hunted to the wickiup of Izeba, who was a respected elder. He then took Josephine by the hand and led her not to her own small dwelling, but to his. He had constructed it himself, and it was larger and better made than hers. Inside, he had laid out a new deerskin dress, beautifully decorated, with simple geometric patterns in porcupine quills, and a new pair of moccasins. He simply looked at her and said, "This is your home now, Iina." She changed into the new clothes. They felt strange and foreign, yet also like a second skin. When she stepped out of the wickiup, the people of the camp stared. They saw her dressed as one of them, standing beside one of their strongest warriors. They saw the public declaration. Izeba came forward and placed a hand on Josephine's shoulder, a silent, powerful gesture of acceptance. That night, she and Tuklo sat by the fire in their shared home. There was an awkward silence between them, the space charged with the new reality of their bond. He was not a man of easy words. He turned to her, his expression serious. "I do not know the ways of your people's husbands," he said. "I had a wife once. She was taken by the coughing sickness years ago. I know how to be a husband to a woman of the Onde. I will hunt for you. I will protect you. I will give you honor. That is my vow." Josephine met his gaze. "And I will honor your home, Tuklo. I will work for our family. I will stand with you. That is my vow." It was a marriage forged in the crucible of survival, a pragmatic and powerful union. But as he reached across the firelight and gently tucked a stray piece of her sun-bleached hair behind her ear, his rough fingers brushing her skin, a different kind of warmth kindled between them, something that had nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with the man and woman who had found each other in the heart of the wilderness. Sean Kane was not a man to be trifled with, and he was certainly not a man to be robbed. The gold at Weeping Springs was an insult, but the theft of his property, Josephine Bellwether, was a declaration of war. In his twisted mind, her survival and integration into the Apache tribe was the ultimate act of defiance. She hadn't just escaped him. She had chosen them over him. It was a stain on his pride that could only be cleansed with blood and fire. He returned to Tombstone not as a defeated prospector, but as a righteous crusader. He used his considerable wealth to hire a dozen of the most ruthless guns for hire in the territory, men who would shoot their own mothers for a fistful of dollars. He then went to the offices of the territorial marshal, a man named Baxter, whose palm he had greased on many occasions. Kane spun a masterful tale of a savage Apache war chief, Tuklo, who had raided a peaceful ranch, slaughtered the Bellwether family, and abducted the beautiful innocent daughter Josephine. He painted a lurid picture of her captivity, her suffering, her forced marriage to the Red Devil. He demanded a posse, not just to recover his stolen mining equipment, but to rescue the poor, defiled white woman. Marshal Baxter, swayed by Kane's influence and the politically popular sentiment of Indian hating, readily agreed. The news came to the rancheria on the wind, carried by scouts who had watched the large party of armed men, a mix of hired guns and official lawmen, leaving Tombstone and heading for the dragoons. They were not a simple raiding party. They were an army. A council of warriors was held. The mood was grim. Some argued for abandoning the camp and fleeing deeper into Mexico. Others, proud and fierce, insisted on making a stand. Tuklo listened to them, all his face, like carved stone. Then he rose to speak. "We cannot run forever," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "Kane knows these mountains. He will hunt us. And if we run, we leave our ancestors' land. We leave our honor. But we will not fight his way. We will not meet his army in the open field. This is our home. We know every rock, every shadow. We will let the mountains fight for us." Then he looked directly at Josephine, who stood at the edge of the council circle, as was her right as his wife. "They come for you," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "They come because they believe a woman of the white eyes cannot choose to be ne. They believe you are weak, that you are a slave. Will you show them the truth?" All eyes turned to her. It was her defining moment. She was no longer a captive, a servant, or even just a wife. She was a symbol. She stepped forward, her fear, a cold knot in her stomach, but her voice clear and strong. "My name is Aina," she declared in flawless Apache. "My husband is Tuklo. My people are the Ande. I will not run. I will fight." A murmur of approval went through the warriors. Her declaration had solidified their resolve. She was one of them now, and they would defend her as such. Tuklo's plan was one of lethal attrition. He would not allow Kane to reach the rancheria where the women and children were. He chose a narrow, winding canyon as the battlefield, a place of high walls, blind corners, and treacherous footing. It was a natural death trap. The women and children, led by Izeba, evacuated the camp, taking supplies, and moving to a secret, well-defended cave system higher in the mountains. Before she left, Josephine went to Tuklo. He was checking the fletching on his arrows, his movements economical and precise. "Tuklo," she said, her voice tight with emotion. He stopped and looked at her. In his eyes, she saw not just the warrior, but the husband, a deep well of concern and fierce protectiveness. He reached out and cupped her face in his calloused hand. "Be safe, Ina," he said simply. "You too," she whispered, her hand covering his. "Come back. I made you a vow," he reminded her. "I do not break my vows." Josephine, however, didn't go with the other women. She had a different kind of knowledge, a different role to play. She knew the mind of Sean Kane. She knew his arrogance, his impatience. With a small group of young swift runners, she took a high position overlooking the entrance to the canyon. She was their eyes. Kane's army entered the canyon with loud, boisterous confidence. Marshal Baxter and his official posse were in the front, followed by Kane and his grim-faced mercenaries. They rode in a tight, clustered formation, a perfect target. From her perch, Josephine watched them advance. Now she said to the young boy beside her. He raised a hawk feather and waved it in a specific pattern. It was the signal. The attack began not with a charge, but with a single perfectly aimed arrow from Tuklo's bow. It struck Marshal Baxter square in the chest, toppling him from his horse. Chaos erupted. Before the posse could react, a volley of arrows rained down from the canyon rim, silent and deadly. Men screamed and fell. Horses reared and bolted. Kane's men, the hardened killers, were better prepared. They dove for cover, their rifles, barking, the sound of the shots echoing like thunder in the narrow space. But they were firing at ghosts. The Apache warriors moved from rock to rock, never presenting a clear target, their arrows and older single-shot rifles picking off the invaders one by one. The battle became a desperate, grueling siege. Kane was trapped. He tried to advance, but the warriors, led by Tuklo, repelled every attempt. He tried to retreat, but a rock slide deliberately blocked the canyon entrance. Josephine, from her vantage point, provided crucial intelligence. Using a system of signals, she informed Tuklo of Kane's movements of flanking attempts, of where his men were weakest. She was the strategist, the unseen general directing her pieces on the board. After a day and a night of being bled dry, Kane was a cornered wolf. Half his men were dead or wounded. The rest were terrified, their bravado washed away by the unseen, relentless enemy. In a fit of rage and desperation, Kane did the one thing Josephine knew he would. He gambled. Tuklo. He roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. I know you're out there. I have a deal for you. Give me the woman, and I'll let the rest of you live. Give me Josephine Bellwether. There was a moment of silence. Then Tuklo's voice, calm and cold, answered from the rocks above. Her name is Ina, and she is my wife. You will have to kill me to take her. Then I'll kill you first, Kane, bellowed, firing his rifle blindly into the rocks. It was the opening Tuklo needed. While Kane was distracted, Tuklo moved silent as a mountain cat circling around behind him. Josephine saw it happen from above. She saw Tuklo drop from a ledge, landing silently behind the rock where Kane was hiding. The final confrontation was not a gunfight. It was a brutal, primal struggle. Knife against knife. Hate against honor. Tuklo was quicker, stronger, fighting on his home ground for his family. He disarmed Kane, the rifle clattering on the rocks. The two men wrestled in the dust, a whirlwind of desperate violence. But in the end it was Tuklo who stood, his chest heaving, his knife bloody. Sean Kane, the man who had burned her world and hunted her across the desert, lay still at his feet. The remaining mercenaries and posse members, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons and surrendered. The war was over. Tuklo stood over the body of his enemy, not in triumph, but with the grim satisfaction of a man who had protected his home. He looked up, his eyes finding Josephine on the ridge. Their gazes locked across the canyon, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had won together. The silence that descended upon the canyon after the last shot was heavier than any sound. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of the fallen and the profound exhaustion of the living. The surviving members of Kane's posse were rounded up, disarmed, and given a stark choice walk back to Tombstone with a message, or be buried in the canyon with their leader. They chose to walk. The message they carried was simple. The people of the Dragoon Mountains wished to be left alone. Their land wasn't for the taking, and their people were not for the saving. Josephine made her way down from the ridge, her legs unsteady. The adrenaline that had sharpened her senses for 2 days was draining away, leaving a deep, bone-weary ache. She saw the cost of their victory in the faces of the women who came to tend to the wounded. The Apache had lost 3 warriors, and several more were injured. Each loss was a hole torn in the fabric of their tight-knit community. She found Tuklo by the creek, washing the blood of Sean Kane from his hands and arms. He didn't look up as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her every step. She stopped beside him, looking at his reflection in the water. The fierce warrior was there, but so was the weary man who carried the weight of leadership and the burden of killing. "It's over," she said, her voice soft. "He is dead," Tuklo corrected her, his voice flat. "But the world he came from is not. Others will come. They always do." It was a harsh truth, but she no longer shied away from such truths. "Then we will face them too," she replied, a new and unfamiliar certainty in her voice. He finally looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw no trace of the terrified, pleading woman he'd found in the desert. He saw Ina, his wife, a woman who had faced the demon of her past and had not flinched. A woman who had directed a battle and helped save his people. "You have the heart of a warrior, Ina," he said, the highest compliment he could bestow. They returned to the rancheria, not to celebration, but to the quiet, solemn work of healing. They buried their dead in the old way. Their bodies returned to the mountain that had been their home. Josephine stood with the other women, her head bowed, mourning the men who had died in part for her. She was no longer an outsider looking in. She was part of the circle, sharing in their grief as she had shared in their fight. In the days that followed, a new sense of peace settled over her. Her life was no longer defined by survival, but by purpose. She worked alongside Ezeba, who now treated her with the familial affection of a daughter, learning the deeper secrets of the desert plants. She taught the children stories in English, and they in turn perfected her Apache, their laughter ringing through the camp. Her bond with Tuklo deepened, evolving beyond the pragmatic vow that had first united them. In the quiet moments, they learned the landscape of each other's souls. He told her of his first wife, of his boyhood, of the traditions and beliefs that guided him. She told him of books and music, of her father's unshakable optimism, and the lingering ache of her lost family. They found their own language, a blend of spoken words and silent understanding. A touch of his hand on her back as she worked was enough to convey his presence and pride. A certain look in her eyes across the fire was enough to make him smile, a rare and beautiful thing that lit up his stern features. Theirs was not a love of whispered poetry and grand gestures, but something quieter, stronger, and more profound, a love forged in fire, tempered by respect, and rooted in the shared soil of their new life. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, she and Tuklo stood on a bluff overlooking their mountain home. The smoke from the cooking fires rose in gentle spirals, and the sounds of the camp of life going on drifted up to them. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. The other world, Josephine thought for a long moment. She thought of the ash and the fire, of Sean Kane's cruel smile. Then she thought of this place, the harsh beauty of the land, the strength of the people, the quiet honor of the man standing beside her. She had lost a home, but she had found a home. She had been used, yes, but she had used that opportunity to build a new life, a new identity, a new self. "The girl who lived in that world is gone," she said, turning to face him. "She died in the desert. You found what was left of her and gave her a new life. You gave her a name." She reached up and touched the strong line of his jaw. "My name is Ina," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that came from the very core of her being. "This is my home, and you, Tuklo, are my husband." He covered her hand with his own, his gaze holding hers. In his eyes, she saw not a captor, not a master, but her partner, her protector, her family. The bargain made in desperation had by some wild and improbable grace become a vow of love. And here in the heart of the Apache wilderness, the lost daughter of the Broken Spur Ranch was finally truly home. And so Josephine Bellwether's story comes to a close, but the journey of Uina was just beginning. Her tale is a raw and powerful reminder that the human spirit is forged in the harshest of crucibles. She transformed from a desperate victim, willing to trade anything for her life, into a woman who defined her own worth, chose her own family, and fought for her own home. It's a story of survival, yes, but more than that, it's about the incredible unexpected ways we can rebuild ourselves from the ashes of who we once were. Home, she discovered, is not always the place we are born, but the place we earn, the people we choose, and the love we are brave enough to build. If this story of courage and transformation in the Old West moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who loves a powerful drama, and subscribing to the channel for more tales from the frontier. And let me know in the comments what part of Josephine's journey resonated with you the most. Thanks for listening.